Okay, moving on to chapter 14, page 424 in your textbook, looking at American music in the 20th century. So first off, it's important to remember that music in America in the 20th century starts to bring together lots of different elements of inspiration, I guess we could say. So anything that's Native American, European, African, Latin American, and Asian elements start to combine. But looking at a very brief history of music in America, looking back to the colonial period. So psalm singing, that was a central social activity in the Protestant church communities in colonial America. So much so that the first book ever printed in the English-speaking colonies in the Americas was the Bay Songbook, published in 1640. In 1770, a new song book came out called the New England Psalm Singer, printed by William Billings, and Billings encouraged people in congregations to learn how to read music literacy being very important because it was such a strong component of social life in the colonial America. So looking into the 19th century, moving on to the 1800s. So first off, there was a lot more people in America in the 1800s versus the 16 and 1700s. So there's more musical activities going on. First of all, bands become a favorite instrumental organization. Pretty much every town, city, village, you name it, there was a band somehow, some way. And just to kind of reflect how important band music was to America, you have the composer Jean-Philippe Sousa, who lived from 1854 and died in 1932, and he's called the March King of America. He is the guy who wrote Stars and Stripes Forever, The Washington Post, and Semper Fidelis. So those are really popular band pieces that have become ingrained with the sound of America. So looking at how music is starting to travel from one coast to the other in America. So symphony orchestras start to become established, particularly along the East Coast. And as people are moving out west, particularly with the Transcontinental Railroad, orchestral music is starting to be introduced out to the states out west. And eventually, orchestra and band music start to merge, and we're mixing those elements into something classical. Vocal music was prominent in the 1800s, especially for private music making. The composer Stephen Foster, pictured here, he wrote the songs Oh Susanna, Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair, and Beautiful Dreamer. If you don't know those songs by name, YouTube them, listen to them really quickly, you will probably recognize them then. They're very prominent and kind of ingrained within American folk music. Sadly, publishers pirated his music, so he did not profit very much from those pieces, and he died in poverty. This is supposed to be a separate bullet point, but Italian operas were super popular at this point as well, so much so that when producing an opera, very oftentimes the text would be translated into English already, so you would be singing an Italian opera in English. And so that was to connect better with the audience, who probably did not know Italian, French, and German. Even excerpts from Verdi's Rigoletto would be played at Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, so that's pretty cool. You usually don't think of Verdi and Lincoln in the same timeline, but actually they were, just on separate continents. So looking at the rise of American nationalism. So we've talked about nationalism in Europe. America is not exempt from that. So looking at the New Orleans native, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, he was a composer and pianist, and he was writing music during the Civil War about the Union. So even though he's from New Orleans, he's writing in support of the Union, and this composition called Union, which mixes quotes from the Star-Spangled Banner, Yankee Doodle, and Hail Columbia. Dvorak, as we've already talked about, actually encouraged nationalism in America. He thought that the future music of the country should pull from African American and Native American melodies. And the pianist and composer Edward McDowell also wrote pieces that would pull inspiration from maybe Native American music or even suggest the American landscape. And you see this with the works New England Idylls and Woodland Sketches. So after 1900, jazz becomes the prominent form of music in America, or the prominent sound, I guess we could say. Composers were looking for what would be the American sound because no one had defined that in the history of the country. Composers like Charles Ives, George Gershwin, Aaron Copland, and several others used popular music as well as other American styles in their composition. So here we're seeing something classical being merged with what is popular music. And that's not too different from what composers would do when they would pull from folk elements to kind of blend in the popular sounds in with classical music. But here we have it in a much more recognizable way because we in the 21st century are not too far removed from this. So we understand that it's a blend of classical and popular sounds. During and after the World Wars, American music starts to become patriotic, such as the song Over There by George M. Cohan. After the World Wars, World War I and II, definitely some major changes artistically in America. As people started to as the Americans entered World War I, the Metropolitan Opera House in New York refused to perform German operas, and that was to support the Americans or the forces fighting against the Germans in World War I. In World War II, composers started to write operas about American history, not that they were no longer interested, but they were trying to support their own agendas and support the American dream and ideals. Americans started to lead classical musical styles after 1940s, and universities start to train and even sponsor composers after 1950. And that is chapter 14. So just a brief overview of what's happening in America as we look at American composers. So chapter 15, this is page 428, looking at Charles Ives. He lived from 1874, died in 1954, and we can definitely consider him ahead of his time, even experimental. He's from Connecticut, and his dad was a bandmaster, and he actually went to school to become an insurance salesman, and he became a millionaire from that, so good for him. So composition was a side project for him, passionate about it, but still a side project. He wrote furiously in his downtime, but he didn't perform his works publicly until he suffered a heart attack. After that heart attack, he backed down from composing. He didn't fully recover from that episode, so he decided to premiere his works instead. Initially, people thought his music was absolutely ridiculous. They thought it was hilarious and just weird and crazy. But some people found value in his work, and eventually his music became respected in the 40s and even won a Pulitzer Prize. So again, his music is experimental, but it's also, although it's experimental, it's on the other side of the spectrum because it is deeply rooted in folk and popular music from his childhood. So you're going to hear things that come from maybe village bands, church choirs, ragtime, barn dances, different elements that he just heard growing up. And he may even incorporate unusual American music, such as a fiddler playing out of tune. Now that doesn't necessarily have to be American, but it's a memory of his, and he would incorporate it into his music. Some of his titles would suggest the New England landscape or ideas of the New England culture. So in his Concord Sonata, he named the different movements after different writers. So you have Emerson, Hawthorne, the Alcotts, and Thoreau. So you may recognize some of those writers. Ives, a quote from him, he says, "Beauty in music is too often confused with something that lets the ears lie back in an easy chair." So his music, he does not consider to be easy listening, and I agree. What you're going to listen to is Putnam's Camp, Reading, Connecticut, written in 1912. It comes from 3 places in New England, and is supposed to evoke a sense of American history and landscape. So he started it in 1912, completed it in 1914, but did not premiere this until 1930. So again, a long period where it's just sitting there. But the whole point of this work is to showcase a memory of his where he heard two different bands playing in the distance. And they're playing two different things, but they're at the same time. So the music kind of clashes together. And you will definitely get a sense of that after listening. So you have information on this on page 429, and you have a listening outline on 430. Okay, next chapter, starting on page 432, George Gershwin. Gershwin lived from 1898 and died in 1937. He wrote a lot of popular songs that are still pretty recognized today. He also wrote musical comedies and jazz-influenced orchestral works, and even opera. So he kind of had his interest on a very broad spectrum. He never really distinguished between popular and classical music as a composer. He really saw them as something that could be combined. A lot of people think that classical music's over here and popular music is over here. He does not view that schism as anything to worry about. His parents were Russian Jewish immigrants, so he is first-generation American, and he grew up in Manhattan. He taught himself piano, so piano is his primary instrument, and then he started taking lessons around age 13. He left school at age 15 to become a piano pounder, his words, and he wanted to write popular songs, and eventually became a songwriter, a very well-known songwriter. His first complete musical was La La Lucille. He wrote that at age 20. Other popular musicals of his would be Lady Be Good, Funny Face, and Of Thee I Sing. And he wasn't just a solo songwriter. He often collaborated with his brother Ira, who would write the lyrics. So George would write the music, Ira would write the lyrics. Some of his more concert stage pieces, I guess we could say, would be the Rhapsody in Blue, written in 1924. And during the 20s, he actually traveled to Europe and he met several well-known composers such as Berg, Ravel, and Stravinsky. While he's in Paris, he wrote the symphonic poem, An American in Paris. He also wrote a very famous opera, Porgy and Bess, and it's basically about the lives of African Americans in Charleston. He actually went down to Folly Island to understand the culture better while he was writing this, and if you haven't heard anything from Porgy and Bess, I strongly suggest you do. You may recognize the song Summertime. So that's probably the best known piece from that opera, but it's a great opera. You should totally watch it. So George Gershwin, the man. We know that he was outgoing, athletic, a womanizer, and actually wealthy. So because he's blending popular and classical music, he's earning a lot of revenue, but he also has that popular music side that's really big in the 20s and 30s, so he was able to generate a lot of revenue quite easily. So much so that he moved out to Hollywood, and he even became tennis buddies with Schoenberg, so that's pretty adorable. I love that. But sadly, he died of a brain tumor at age 38. What you are going to look at is the Rhapsody in Blue. You have information on page 433 and a listening guide on 434. Rhapsody in Blue was written in 1924. It's probably one of his most famous compositions, along with lots of other contenders. But it's a one-movement work for piano and orchestra. And like the title suggests, it's talking about blue. It's blues-inspired. So you're going to hear some jazz references, and the piano line, which is really quite virtuosic, reflects Gershwin's own abilities on the instrument. Okay, and you'll have this in the playlist. Going to the next chapter, this is page 436, looking at William Grant Still. So Still lived from 1895, died in 1978, and he's part of the Harlem Renaissance. So that's a time period that lasts from 1917 to 1935. His work, the Afro-American Symphony, which was written in 1931, was the first composition by a black composer to be performed by a major American symphony orchestra. So in many ways, William Grant Still is opening a lot of doors for a lot of people. The Harlem Renaissance, in case you need a refresher on what that is, it's a time of intellectual, social, and artistic explosion centered in Harlem, Manhattan, and New York City, and it spans the 20s and even a little bit beyond. And that comes from Wikipedia, and you can read the Wikipedia article about what all happened in the Harlem Renaissance and how it ties into the civil rights movement. Some famous individuals from the Harlem Renaissance. So you have Langston Hughes. I remember reading a lot of Langston Hughes in high school and college. And what we're looking at, musicians, particularly jazz musicians, but not strictly jazz, as we're seeing with William Grant Still. But some famous ones would be Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, and Duke Ellington. All right, so looking at his life here. He grew up in Arkansas. He studied violin as a child, and at age 16, he's already enrolling in university, so we can surmise that he is a super intelligent person. So he went to Wilberforce University to study pre-med, but he actually turned to music. Later in life, he had to leave school, and he became an arranger of popular music and also a performer. While he's doing that, he starts to work for the composer/publisher W.C. Handy. So this is W.C. Handy. He published a lot of blues music and made blues a popular form. So W.C. Handy is a really interesting figure in the story of music in America. But he's working for W.C. Handy, and in 1917, he goes back to college, goes to Oberlin College Conservatory. Oberlin was and still is a major music school in America, so that's really cool that he got into Oberlin. So he went to continue his training, but he had to leave to serve in the Navy during World War I. After World War I, he finished school at Oberlin and then moved to New York, where he worked as a popular musician, but he was still composing concert work. So again, we see a composer who doesn't see that great divide between classical and popular music, instead working in both areas and finding a lot of success. He studied with two composers, George Whitefield Chadwick and Edgar Varese, and Varese is a modernist that we'll talk about next week. But he William Grant Still rejected the avant-garde style that Varese implemented, and he decided to embrace his own style with a uniquely African-American quality. And so, with that, he is receiving a lot of critical acclaim in New York for his innovative approach to music. Looking at his legacy, the Afro-American Symphony, when it was premiered, was so successful in New York that it actually launched his career as a classical composer. He was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship, and he got to move to LA, and he actually wrote film scores, so we're starting to see how composers are working in the area of film, concert works, and operas. He is the first African-American composer to conduct a major symphony orchestra, and he's the first African-American to have an opera performed by a major opera company. He's not the first to write an opera, but as we can see, he is breaking through a lot of barriers that happened during the segregation period of America. And his operas, Troubled Island and A Bayou Legend, are dealing with some difficult material, so he doesn't back away from these troubling storylines. He embraces it and uses it as a platform. All right, so looking at his first major symphony, the Afro-American Symphony, he actually wrote this at the beginning of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression during the 1930s, where a lot of people were out of a job, the economy tanked. Quotes from Mr. Still, he says, "I was jobless long enough to let the symphony take shape, and I wanted to demonstrate that the blues, so often considered a lowly expression, could be elevated to the highest musical level." And so you're definitely going to see that blues inspiration in this piece. Okay, what you are going to listen to comes from the third movement of the Afro-American Symphony. He's using elements like the banjo, spirituals, and jazz tunes, different sources of inspiration, as well as subtitles for each movement to denote the African-American character to each piece. And each movement includes a quote from the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was also part of the Harlem Renaissance. And you can read about this on page 437, and you have a listening guide on 437. Next, Aaron Copland. This is chapter 18, page 438. So Copland lived from 1900, died in 1990. He is also from New York. He's from Brooklyn, and he is the child of Russian Jewish parents. At age 15, he discovered music, that's how your book puts it, and he decided that he wanted to be a musician. He was not brought up in a musical household, but he found music as something really fascinating, something that he wanted to do, and just decided to go for it. As a composer, he liked modern music, so things like Stravinsky and Schoenberg, and in 1921, he went to study in France with Nadia Boulanger. She and her sister Lily are some of the people that you can choose to study or research for the composer project. But Nadia Boulanger, she taught several leading composers around the world, particularly Americans, and so she's like super, super cool. Anybody who's anybody in the 20th century either was taught by Nadia or taught by somebody who studied under her. But Copland's musical career can be split into 3 different portions. So you have phase 1, which is Return to New York. It's American in character. And so that's about 1925 to 1930. He is incorporating elements of jazz, blues, and ragtime. In phase 2, he goes into more modern styles. He wants to be serious, a lot of dissonance, much more sophisticated than what he thought his first period exhibited. And in phase 3, this is when the Great Depression happens, and he wants his music to reach more people and be more accessible. So he's trying to incorporate American folklore within his music, or the topic of the music. So with this, you get the 3 ballets, Billy the Kid, Rodeo, and Appalachian Spring. We're going to listen to something from Appalachian Spring. And at this point, Copland becomes synonymous with American music. People go, what's American music sound like? And people go, sound like? And people are like, yep, Copland sounds like American music. His musical style, what can we say? What generalizations can we make? It sounds simple, but it's professional and well-crafted. Okay, so that's a really interesting quality to have, where you make it seem so easy, but it's actually quite complex. There's a clear texture, and that is to evoke the American landscape. His music is tonal, okay, but he still embraces 20th century techniques. So he still uses polychords, changing meters, percussive elements, and even a serial technique using tone rows. But it's still tonal. There is still a tonal center. So that, again, reflects how it seems simple, but it's actually not. And he was very into outreach with American people. He wanted to make sure his music got out to the everyday person. So he gave concerts, he would lecture, write books, teach, and even conduct. So Appalachian Spring, written between 1943 and 44, was a ballet for the modern dancer and choreographer Martha Graham. It was performed as a ballet, and he also arranged it for orchestral suite because he knew that if it was just a ballet, it wouldn't be performed super often, whereas if it were an orchestral suite, it would get performed more often. So he was really smart with that. The ballet describes a pioneer celebration in spring around a newly built farmhouse in the Pennsylvania hills. What we're going to look at is section, I believe, 7. Yes, section 7, which is Theme and Variations on Simple Gifts. Some of you may recognize this tune. It is a Shaker melody. So the Shakers were a religious group in Pennsylvania from like the 1700s. And so this tune, "'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis a gift to come down where you ought to be." You may recognize that. If it's new to you, after listening to section 7 from Appalachian Spring, you will definitely know the tune. All right, you find this information on page 440 and the listening guide on 441. Going back really quick, this is the original Martha Graham choreography that you're going to see in the playlist. And the last chapter for today, Alberto Ginastera, this starts on page 442. So he lived from 1916 and died in 1983. He's Argentinian. So Ginastera is one of the most prominent Latin American composers in the 20th century. And a lot of people find his music as a source of inspiration because he's so avant-garde. He started to study piano at age 7, and at age 22, he graduated from the National Conservatory in Buenos Aires. And at age 25, he became a faculty member at that college, and he taught another composer that we will talk about next week, Astor Piazzolla. And so in 1945, he goes to America so that he could study with Copland, and in 1947, he comes back to Argentina to continue teaching. He was internationally recognized by 1950, and in the 60s, he was so well known that 3 of his operas were performed in America. Between the 60s and the early 70s, he directed the Latin American Center for Advanced Musical Studies in the avant-garde style. So we really associate avant-garde with Ginastera. His music is cutting edge and innovative in ways that we had not yet seen. And because he was so well known and making strides in all sorts of areas of music, a movement from his first piano concerto was actually adapted into the song Toccata by the rock group Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So what can we say about his style? He likes forceful rhythms, powerful percussion. I would say more so than any other composer up to this point that we've heard of. And dense orchestral textures. He is a nationalist. He likes to use Argentinian folk material. And in the 50s, he adopts the 12-tone system. So kind of like Stravinsky, he also adapts his 12-tone system to create new sounds and to break away from the structure of tonality. He would also use post-1945 techniques such as tone clusters, chance music, and microtones. We will talk about the post-1945 techniques next week. So he is kind of foreshadowing what is going to happen in the following decades. What you're going to look at comes from the Estancia Suite, written in 1941, which was originally supposed to be a ballet, and the Estancia is basically an Argentine ranch. You have information about this on 443 and a listening guide on 444. So this was originally supposed to be a ballet. That's what the music was commissioned for. However, the ballet group that this was being written for disbanded before the work premiered. So Ginastera had all this music, and he turned it into an orchestral suite. So the suite has 4 movements. The very last one is Malambo, which is what you're going to listen to. And it's a dance for men, and it's performed by the gaucho, who is the main character in this ballet. And in the ballet concept, the idea of, while it was still supposed to be a ballet, it was supposed to be where these guys are trying to outdance each other. So as you're listening to this, remember, people were actually supposed to dance to this. And if you're like me, you're going to go, oh my gosh, that should not be physically possible. So you have this in your playlist to listen to.